Hello, everybody. My name is Piotr. I'm working in INFOBLOX for last 5 years. I'm a solution architect, but actually what I like to do, what my passion is I try to observe different new examples of malware, APT attacks, and I try to look into one view how the attackers were using DNS. So today I'm going to show you the experiences and what we have seen in the past. Maybe first the question, can you read the file names from here? Because if not, then I encourage to come closer, because I intend to do some demo as well. So it will not make sense if you will not see from the long pipe, OK? That's in a second, but yeah. So first, let's look at the cyber kill chain and how basically attackers are using, how they do the attacks and how they're using DNS in the attacks. So that's the cyber kill chain model. Maybe not a perfect one, but basically it's something we usually work with because it allows us to communicate easily between the security people. So we have the reconnaissance phase, where the attacker is trying to get as many information as possible about the victim. We have the weaponization phase, where they prepare the tools they will use. So they buy or write malicious code. In case of DNS, they will register domain names, set up DNS servers, maybe write some code which will do some strange things with DNS. Then we have a delivery phase, where they basically deliver the malicious payload to the victim. And usually, as we know, it's often in an email with attachment or an email with a link. It doesn't have to be an email, of course. Could be a message from, theoretically, a headhunter on LinkedIn, and it could contain malicious link. Could be Facebook Messenger message, whatever, right? If this is a link to any malicious content, then usually it's provided as a URL with fully qualified domain name, FQDN, right? So it needs to be resolved. And then there is a first possibility for you as defenders to make some actions. Maybe not the first, because during reconnaissance weaponization, we also can do some actions. But this is really first defending thing we can do. So we could have a secure DNS resolver. If our employee or if anything else tries to resolve a malicious link, that could be blocked. And usually people, when they think about secure DNS, they think about this, right? We have a DNS, we have a list of bad domains. Someone tries to resolve it, you block it. That's the most simple way. But today I will show you not these things, but something more advanced. Then we have an exploitation phase. Sometimes attacker can use some vulnerabilities in DNS software. Could be DNS server software, could be DNS client software. Every machine which needs to resolve a name has a DNS client in TCP/IP stack, and they also have vulnerabilities. Also, in the exploitation phase, we can look at some possibilities to exploit some human vulnerabilities or process vulnerabilities. For example, domain registration. Sometimes we focus about defending our infrastructure, our servers, and so on, but we forget that our domain is registered in some external company. How secure are they, right? Or how secure is our account there? Because if someone will hijack our domain and forward this domain, let's say, delegate this domain to some malicious name servers, any employee, any customer connecting to our VPN concentrator, to our mail server, are we sure he's connecting to the right one, right? So it's also an important point. Then we have an installation phase where the attacker basically installs malware on the host, and DNS is not used much here. Where DNS is used at most is the C2 phase, command and control. Because first, the malware needs to have an IP address of the C2 server to which he can connect, right? It could be hard-coded in the malware, but it's not so common. It happens, of course, but it's not so common. Because if someone will block this IP, then basically all the work which was done before is lost. The communication with the infected system is lost, and all the money, the time invested, basically from the attacker's perspective, is lost. So usually they try to somehow provide backup ways. For example, they will use C2 server name as a hard-coded domain name. Then they can switch easily IP addresses. It's not very difficult to block this as well, but at least there is something more. Instead of hard-coding domain name, they could possibly generate randomly domain names to which they will try to connect. So the malware is randomly generating domain names. They know what domains will be generated for today. They registered one of them, and basically then they have the connection. If someone will block this domain name, no issue, because they have another one and another and another. There are also different other ways. For example, there are some malwares which will get the C2 domain name, for example, from legitimate cryptocurrency services. So there was GroupTeba botnet, for example, which is checking in a cryptocurrency service what amount of, in this case, it was details of the transaction, cryptocurrency transaction. And those details contained encrypted domain name of the C2 server. So wherever they want to change the C2 domain name, they can by using a legitimate service. Then, after they have the IP address, they register the infected machine. They send some basic reconnaissance information about this machine. They will, the infected machine will ask, what next? Then the C2 server will say, like, OK, download this new malicious module we have. Tell me what are the systems there. Maybe download MS-SQL exploitation module, and so on and so on. Run this command, do the screenshot, send me the result, and so on. So there is bidirectional communication. This communication can, of course, be done in many different ways. There are almost no limits here. DNS is one of them, which is commonly used, especially if attackers want to stay undetected for a very long time. So basically, then, a DNS query from infected host contains some hidden information in the fully qualified domain name. Then the answer from the C2 server, this is DNS reply, contains some encoded information inside. And this is quite difficult to detect because most of security solutions, they focus on web and email, right? That's the most popular protocols on the internet. Most security solutions focus on that. But there is this third protocol, which is also extremely popular on the internet, but less security solutions are monitoring that. So it's usually easier to stay longer undetected if attacker is doing C2 over DNS. Finally, we have actions and objectives. So attacker tries to achieve what he actually wanted at the beginning. Maybe he wanted to steal some information. Maybe he wanted to make some impact on availability of services. Maybe he just wants to encrypt the data and request the ransom, right? DNS here can be used either as a method of stealing data, because, again, data can be leaking outside to the C2 server, inside of DNS query in the fully qualified domain name. Or, of course, it could be making an impact on availability. Because DDoS attacks, DNS is one of the most popular attacks to do DDoS attacks. So let's look at details how data is flowing inside of DNS queries. Imagine we have an infected endpoint here. Infected endpoint means anything which has a CPU, memory, and network connectivity. Could be printer, UPS, server, VPN gateway, whatever, right? Sorry. So we have an infected host. We have a local DNS resolver. Most likely, Microsoft DNS running on Active Directory controller. This is what we typically see in the companies. We have a bunch of firewalls. And how data is flowing from this host to attacker's server is inside of DNS query in the hostname part. So here we have a query for some hostname in cornpany.pw. So this domain was registered by the attacker. It's served by this DNS server controlled by the attacker. So wherever anybody will ask about any host in cornpany.pw, this query will finally go to the attacker, right? So this machine will take some sensitive information, encode it, cut it into the pieces, put it in the hostname port at this cornpany.pw or whatever domain was registered by the attacker, and it will send this query to the local DNS resolver, not to the C2 server directly, right? This server will look at the query. It's normal FQDN, normal DNS query, RFC compliant. Let's just resolve it, right? So then this query goes to the next DNS server, and finally it will finish at the attacker DNS server. He will take the hostname part, wait for another query, take another hostname part, and so on, concatenate it, decode it, maybe decrypt it if it was encrypted before, and he has the data. The beauty of that from the attacker's perspective is there is no need for direct communication with the C2 server. So this host might be a CCTV camera with no internet access whatsoever, but as long as this device can send a DNS query to this local, I don't know, AD controller, for example, then it will serve as a proxy, right? Because it will then create a new DNS query for this domain and send further to internet. Then the reply comes back to DNS, and DNS sends it back to the host. So that's a basically multi-hop proxy mechanism, which is built into DNS system by default. So that's why attackers also use this technique. Let me do a short demo. I will try to make it as big as possible. So let's say this is infected host, and we have sensitive information in test1 JPEG file. And let's try to send it outside. Here we have a, let's say, simulation portal, which will work as a C2 server. Here we have a section where the transfer files will land. So we can go here. Right now, we have no data, 0 entries, right? I will send the file. We will see if it will land here. And then we have a generator of the scripts, which will be run on the infected machine. Basically, we give the name of the file here, DNS server which we want to test. I specify one which is not secure, because I don't want it to be blocked. So I'm not using, for example, mine. I have a special agent which would block that. So I will use Google DNS because basically it's unsecure. I mean, it does not check the name of the domain. And then we have 3 types of scripts generated. Perl, Unix shell, Windows PowerShell. Basically, attackers can do whatever they want, right? I mean, there are thousands of ways to run the code. I'm using macOS, so I will do the shell script. So let's put that here, and let's run the script. Script is very simple. It takes data from the file, encodes it into hex, cut into the pieces, and send it as a DNS query. So then we have, as you see, one part is changing here. That's the hex encoded JPEG file. Then we have a query number, subdomain, and finally some domain name. Now, when we switch back to the C2 server, we should now start see the data. So yeah, it's like 100 pieces out of 153. 152. So basically, it was probably finished already. Let's refresh. And then we have the whole file, which right now is not served from my laptop, but actually from the xinfoblox.com domain, which is served from US. So this is the way how you transmit data inside of DNS queries. Script is very simple, as you see here. Basically, for Linux, Unix, macOS, what you use is, for example, hexdump command, which is built-in tool in every Unix, Linux, macOS system. And then we use host command to send the DNS query. So basically, we are using leaf of the land technique. Nothing needs to be uploaded to the infected machine. We are just using what we have found on the machine. We, I mean the attackers now, from the perspective of the attacker. So this is as simple as that. The other direction is also simple. You just, for example, let's say I want to download a new malicious script to be run. Again, let me quickly provision that. So now, now I want to download new file. I have 3 files here, and I want to download a new file. Sorry, I did mistake when copying. And it should be bash. Somewhere. Sure. That was PowerShell. Might not run. So here we just ask about several records in this domain name. Record 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, TXT type. Inside we have hex encoded data, and this data after concatenating is written to the file, and we can see this file. It's just some kind of script to be run, right? So this is how you get the data the other direction. So basically, use both techniques to achieve C2 communication bidirectionally. Okay, let's look how the real guys are using that. Let's start with something simple. Alina POS is a malware which is stealing data about credit cards. Usually they attack some kind of shops, hotels, restaurants, or other simple thing. This is how they send data about credit cards. So it's rather long query, as you see. So even on the first look, it looks strange. Let's try to decode this information. So I will copy this query and put it into the CyberChef tool. I will try to make it bigger again. It's not the best. We need to remove the domain name because it does not contain any information. Maybe let me do it in a slightly different way. Yeah, let's try that. So we have this query. It looks like base64 encoded because it has case-sensitive letters, some digits. So let's try first from base64. Instead of plus and slash, which are normal in base64, here we see dash and underscore, which means it's probably a URL safe version of base64. We don't see any data and information yet, so probably something else is used here. Maybe encryption, maybe not, we don't know. But because it's a simple malware attacking simple companies, most likely they do not do the encryption. Most likely they will do XOR to obfuscate the information. So let's do brute force on XOR because we don't know the key. And now we just need to look if for any key we will have a human readable information, right? I know the results, so let me scroll faster. And here, for the AA XOR key, we actually can see the information. So here we, for example, have an ID of infected computer, because if you send DNS query, you actually lose the source IP of the infected computer on the way, because it's replaced with the DNS server's IP. So we need to somehow encode this information, and attacker usually do it inside of FQDN. Then you have a Donovan PC, the computer name, POS.exe process, which is actually processing credit card information on this computer. And then we have a credit card number, expiry date, and some other information about the credit card. So this is how this data flows. The bad news is that this is not encrypted, and it goes over internet. So it is being stored on passive DNS sensors, on different telco networks, and so on. So actually, we lose this data, and it's visible in many places. So this is how it is done here. Let's look at something more advanced. Ransomware 5 hands. They were getting initial infection via either stolen credentials to remote desktop servers or, for example, some zero-day vulnerabilities in VPN gateways. Then they deployed Sombrack backdoor, which is connecting to the C2 server and doing C2 communication over DNS. And here we can see some queries generated by them. So we have some domain name, feticos.com, and then hex-encoded information. This domain name was used only in one attack. Every attack they change. That's most typical for advanced attackers. And then in the IP, in the reply, we can see that for each query, there is a different IP address. The reason for that is that it's not an IP address. It's just 4 bytes of information being sent as a DNS reply from the C2 server. So basically, that's why if we look at some passive DNS traffic and we see queries for theoretically randomly generated host names, and then we see different IP addresses in the replies, it's quite obvious that this is bidirectional communication. The other group which likes to use DNS for C2 communication is TrickBot, Russian-speaking criminal group. They basically infect as many business computers as possible, and then later they sell access to them. They can, upload different malicious modules on such computers. Could be ransomware, could be DDoS, could be cryptocurrency miner, whatever their customer wants. Usually they do C2 over HTTPS, but also they have a module called Anchor DNS, which is deployed for premium customers. So for example, if they infect an Active Directory controller, and if they would do C2 over HTTPS, that would be easy to detect, because AD should not connect to some unknown host on the internet over HTTPS. Nobody's browsing from AD controller, or shouldn't, at least. But AD controller is usually having Microsoft DNS on it, and it's a default resolver for the company. So it gets a lot of DNS queries for different domain names, and it sends those queries to the internet, to thousands, millions of different domain names, and get the reply back. So if you do C2 over DNS, then basically you're hiding in this traffic, and it doesn't look like an anomaly. So that's why they decided to deploy this module called Anchor DNS wherever they infect Active Directory controller. Anchor DNS is then used for many different things. This is one of the example, Ryuk ransomware infection, which started with DocuSign themed spear phishing mail. An hour after initial execution of the buzzer loader, they deploy Cobalt Strike Beacon and then Anchor DNS. And then we can see, well, maybe you can see, maybe not, but basically it's, again, C2 communication over DNS. So we have a domain name, which was, I will show history of this domain in a second maybe, and then we have some data encoded in the query, and then again, different IP for each query. So basically, it's a bidirectional communication which they can use to control the infected host and deploy the ransomware. If we look at this domain, that's a history of this domain. 28th of January, it was registered, so a week before the attack. On 29th, it was detected and placed in our feed of newly registered domains. So we have one feed where we have all, well, not all, but let's say we have domains which were registered in last 3 days. But they did not continue the attack. They did not start the attack, actually, within the first 3 days of the registration. They waited. But then, on February 4th, we could notice this domain being placed in our feed of newly observed domains. So we have another feed when we have domains which were first observed, first used on the internet in last 3 days. So when they started, then this domain was submitted into this feed, and then it was there until February 7th. Between February 4th and 5th, we can see basically different IPs as a response, so the C2 communication started. So even if the victim here would be using simple defense method of blocking newly observed domains, only this would stop this attack, because C2 communication would not happen. Then, of course, if it would be happening, because maybe domain was, I don't know, aged for a month or a year, happens with advanced attacks, then you need to somehow detect C2 over DNS communication. Okay, I will speed up maybe. So this is this interesting example of the malware using actually legitimate cryptocurrency services. It's asking about operation return field, and inside we have an encrypted C2 domain name with AES. And after decryption, you can see the name of the C2 domain, easywbdesign.com. How we detected this is a different story. We actually saw in the customer traffic such queries. So we have hex-encoded data and the easywbdesign.com. So even though we didn't know the domain name is malicious, we actually detected C2 communication. And then we start investigation, reverse engineer the malware, and then we see, okay, so the C2 extraction is actually using cryptocurrency service, which become more popular now. So there are several. In the last 2 years, I saw at least 4 malware families which are using .chain info, blockchain info, and some other services like this to basically download the C2 domain name. How we detect? So how you can block C2 over DNS communication? One of the methods is basically blocking domain name based off the reputation. So if you know domain name is bad, you can block it and that's it, right? It's simple. But how do you know that the domain which was registered a week ago is bad? You don't know. So this method is basically good, but only for very simple attackers, right? Then we might use signature detection. So if we know how malware is doing the C2 communication, let's say they build queries in a specific way, just like our tool does. Yeah? There is a hostname part, query number, some subdomain, specific length. You can build a signature and detect it. And our tool is detected by many security solutions because it's known, it's basically here for 5 or 6 years or more. But the attackers, they will write their own code. Or if they buy some code, they will customize it. And then you cannot detect it because signature will not trigger. Just if you change the query number from the second position to the first one, the signature will not trigger, right? So it's good, but only also for, let's say, simple attackers. So what you need to do is basically focus on the behavior, because there are some typical characteristics of this traffic, right? You have unique host names. They are not responded from the DNS cache. Reply may be very specific. So there are some specific things you can detect. We actually do all these 3 things, but only the last algorithm is able to detect unknown C2 communication, independent of the domain name, independent of malware family, APT group, whatever. So what we do, INFOBLOX is a DNS server, and when the query comes, it will check several attributes of the traffic inside of the query for every type of the query. Doesn't matter what the query type is. We will measure different things. Each of these attributes have some importance in this algorithm. And finally, we say, this looks like C2 communication, and let's block it or redirect it or maybe just log it. Action is another story, right? Detection is one thing, mitigation is the other. So what we check? For example, n-gram distribution. N-gram is a sequence of n characters. We check bgrams and trigrams. So we first take first 2 characters from the domain name, and we check, are those 2 characters next to each other? Typical in natural language or not? Like if we see AD together, that's normal. There are plenty of words which contain AD. But if we see QX, there are not many words which contains QX, so that's suspicious. So we score higher, and we take another 2 characters, and another, and another, and another. Then we do the same for 3 grams, and we check again. And this gives quite nice results. Here you have good domain names in green and malicious domains generated automatically by the malware in red. So you can see that you can distinguish which one it's typical for DNS tunneling, which one is not. Of course, there is potential for false positives. There is some small amount of green under it. So you need to do more, because otherwise you will hit very big number of false positives. We check also entropy, because entropy gives you information how many different characters are in the string. If you will have just 2 characters, like A and B, you repeat it 100 times, the entropy will be very low, because there are just 2 characters. But if you will use all the characters from the alphabet, the entropy will be very high. So basically, we also use that. Then we check lexical things, such as what's the ratio of digits? Normally, in domain names, there are not too many digits. What's the ratio of vowels? Domains usually are containing words. Words needs to have vowels. So typical ratio of vowels in domain names, it's between 18 to 50, 55%. If it's below 18, it's suspicious. So we add it with the higher score. We check Gini index, classification error, number of labels, how fast the queries were sent, was the delay fixed or random, size, is it big or not. So we're checking like a dozen of different things. Each of these attributes have a specific attribute weight, importance, and then finally we calculate the score. You cannot use just one attribute, because otherwise you will have a lot of false positives. So thanks to using this number of attributes, we have very low positive ratio. So in my customers in Poland, it's usually maybe 1 or 3 domains per month, which they need to check manually if it's C2, or maybe it's just that the new application they start to use. So it's very, very low. I think I will skip that. Well, OK. Sometimes C2 domain names are created randomly out of the words. We call it dictionary domain generation algorithm. So basically, malware has 2 word lists in the malware. And when it needs to generate C2 domain name, it will take one word from one list, second word from the second list, combine it, and make it as a domain, which is not suspicious because you have facegone.net, right? walkroad.net. Nothing special about it. Yeah? So how do you detect that? You cannot use the previous algorithm. So what we do, as DNS query comes, we build a graph of words used in these domain names. So we split the query into words, and if the word will reappear in many queries, then in the graph of words we build, it will be a connecting node. If it will not appear again, it will be just a leaf node. So if you take a host which is doing normal internet connections, normal internet domain resolving, this graph will be looking like this one. But if you take a host which is infected with malware using this technique, the graph will look like this one. So it's very, very different. And you know that this host is most likely infected, right? So this is what we do on the fly when the query comes. Then what we can also help is, because we are not only DNS server, we are also DHCP server, IP address database, so we can also help to identify this host which is infected. Because if you have a big network and you have an Excel file, well, usually we can guarantee the Excel is not current, right? Because people forget something to update it. What we do is automatic discovery. For example, we scan network devices using SNMP, getting ARP tables, routing tables, CDP, LLDP, MAC tables from the switches. We combine this information, put it into IP address database. So then, if SOC or any guy who is doing incident response needs to check what's this IP which is doing these strange queries, he can look at the IP address database and he can see, okay, this address is a Windows server, but actually it is running as a virtual machine, so it's not a physical hardware. In this virtual machine, this IP is assigned to a card VMNIC1. On the VMware, this is connected to virtual switch vSwitch 9. This VM works on a virtual ESX host named DNS demo, and this in this ESX host is connected to Cisco 3750, which name is TAE demo on gigabit 301. So you have visibility into exactly how this IP is connected to the physical network and where. So this speeds up the reactions you can take. OK, that was just a sneak preview of what I normally do on a 6 hours workshop, because it's not possible to show all the examples, all the different techniques attackers is using. So if you are interested, you want to get more information, more knowledge for you, for the teams you work in, we can organize such training for you. If you are a company big enough, we can just come and do this. If you will be a very small entity, we can just bring more people together and do this. We do it for free. So basically, we spread a lot of education, not much marketing, just as today. So we also talk about different cybersecurity things like pyramid of pain, MITRE ATT&CK framework, different techniques such as lookalike domains, homograph domain names, which is using special international domain name characters, and things like that. So just come to either to me directly now or later to our booth, and we can schedule something.